It's been about 3 decades since the Mega Drive was at its peak. I am a much older person now. I somehow seem to have aged at about twice the rate of a normal human, and yet even now, as I enter my final decrepitude, there are still Mega Drive games that have so far eluded my grasp and which I have long intended to play. Story of Thor is one such game. Well, it hasn't exactly eluded my grasp. In fact, it's been sitting on my hard drive as part of the Mega Drive Classics collection for quite a few years now, but I've never got around to playing it. Which is kind of weird. Back in the day, it was a game I was definitely aware of. I remember seeing magazine articles and thinking it looked cool as hell. The colourful, vibrant graphics really leapt off the page. And yes, for my younger viewers, static images printed on actual paper were once the standard way of checking out upcoming games. I never bought Story of Thor though, possibly because by the time it came out in 1995, the Mega Drive was nearing the end of its lifespan, and there were so many awesome cheap games in its library that buying a full-price new game was kind of a tough sell. My cash reserves at the time were highly limited, so no change there, and for me the last of the Mega Drive years were mainly spent catching up on the stuff I'd missed out on from earlier in the 90s. But now at last the time has come to dive into the world of Story of Thor, and see if it can live up to those impressive screenshots that I can still remember with such clarity. And yes, I know for a large part of the world this game was rebranded as Beyond Oasis, but here in the wonderful land of Oz, it was always Story of Thor, and so it has existed in my mind for many years. Also, I should point out that I am indeed playing this through the Mega Drive Classics collection on Steam, but I avoided using the incredibly tempting rewind feature. I may not have avoided using save states, but I'll get onto that. Now, the first really notable thing about this game, for me at least, is the name Yuzo Koshiro on the title screen. He's one of the most famous and influential composers of video game music in history, and I've talked about him before in my video on the Streets of Rage series, which contains probably his most well-known compositions. But beyond just music, he also formed his own development studio called Ancient, which worked on the later Streets of Rage games and also handled the Master System versions of Sonic 1 and 2, which I also did a video on, incidentally. And they developed Story of Thor as well, with Koshiro also providing the music. So my expectations for the audio side of things are already sky high. The game starts with an impressive, for the time, cartoony intro in which our protagonist Ali finds a gold armlet and is told by a mysterious entity that he needs to save the world from the possessor of the silver armlet because they're evil or something. There was an ancient battle, the magical armlets were presumed lost, blah blah blah. This is ultimately not a very story-heavy game, although that might not be immediately apparent. You start off in a small village highly reminiscent of any number of JRPGs from the era, bustling with NPCs you can talk to. But this place, along with the castle occupied by the king, who happens to be your father, are really the only places you'll encounter other people, and there aren't many of them. This isn't a game with an intricate plot or interesting characters, it's far more focused on delving into dungeons and enemy strongholds and the combat you'll experience within. And the combat makes a good first impression. Ali moves nimbly around the battlefield, and it's satisfying to stab things with your stabby stick. You don't exactly have a huge range of moves in your arsenal, but the ones you do have are mostly fun and effective. You can dash and jump and combine those elements with attacks. You can hold down the attack button briefly for a stronger attack, or even do a couple of Street Fighter-esque special moves such as a wide sweeping slash, which can be incredibly useful. Anyway, your father sends you out to recover the water spirit Ditto. No, not that one. This Ditto is a fairy that can be summoned with your new gold armlet. Once you've completed this short dungeon and defeated a giant enemy crab at least. It's a suitable first boss, as it's intimidating but not very challenging. Its attacks are kind of hard to avoid, at least for one as slow and doddery as I, but it also doesn't do much damage and healing items are abundant. Well, at this point they are. So it's not too much of a struggle to acquire Ditto, the first of 4 magical friends you'll be able to summon throughout your adventure. The summoning mechanic is a key part of the game and actually a very interesting element, by 16-bit standards at least. To summon one of your companions, you need to shoot a projectile from your gold armlet at a relevant item or environmental feature. As you might be able to guess, in order to summon Ditto, the water spirit, you need to aim for water. And this can be water in any form, be it a mountain stream, a fountain, even a water drop falling from a leaky ceiling. Later, when you acquire the fire spirit, he can be summoned by hitting a burning lamp, a campfire, or, creatively, fireballs conjured by enemies. Having a summon out drains your magic points slowly but steadily, and using their abilities removes a large chunk of them, so you can't just have them following you around all the time, but they're a useful resource when used wisely. Ditto, for instance, can heal you and summon a water bubble that will stun foes, and can transform into a cyclone that will roam around the screen at random, doing significant damage to enemies in its path. Furthermore, each summon can clear certain obstacles, with Ditto, naturally enough, being able to extinguish fires with her water bubble. This allows for some basic Metroidvania elements, as you can return to places you've already been to see what new areas might have been unlocked by your newly acquired abilities. So, with the clever summoning mechanic that relies on properly utilising the environment, combined with the necessity to employ different abilities to overcome various obstacles, the elements are here for some truly imaginative and compelling puzzle-based gameplay. Unfortunately, the game never quite manages to harness all those elements to their full potential. The puzzles, such as they are mostly either simple and easy or simple and annoying. Often the solution amounts to nothing more than a trek past respawning enemies and annoying platform sections back to the closest place you can get the summon you need. Only occasionally did the designers come up with something that required real ingenuity. Nevertheless, the potential was there, and for a game of this vintage I can't be too disappointed that it didn't quite manage to live up to it. Game development in those days was still kind of primitive in some ways, and honestly what they did achieve in terms of puzzle construction was above average by the standards of the day. It's just that, it's no Lemmings, still the best designed puzzle game of all time in my opinion. But of course it's not trying to be. Like I say, the combat and dungeoneering is the main focus, and in those ways it's mostly successful. Not entirely, and I'll get to that, but overall it is a success. For now though, it's time to track down the Fire Spirit to Freet. No, not that one. He resides at the end of another dungeon, of course, and although this one isn't a huge challenge either, some of the flaws in the combat are starting to become a little more apparent. Mostly it comes down to how irritating it can be just to land a hit on some enemies. Check out this section. The bats hover out of reach and the snakes are too low to the ground to be hit by most attacks. You do have options here. Jumping attacks can take out the bats and a sweep attack will hit the snakes, but the controls aren't quite responsive or fine-tuned enough to avoid frustration. Mostly in situations like this, you'll just be mashing buttons while soaking up the damage, and hoping you have enough healing items to see you through. Fortunately though, while encounters like this aren't exactly rare, they're not so frequent or arduous that they become a major frustration, and most of the combat is genuinely fun. The boss fights, for example, are really rather cool, such as this one that guards the way to a Freet. The oil on the ground reduces your movement speed, which is kind of annoying, but it's not a massive hindrance. And so, a Freet joins your party. He's pretty useful in combat, as he'll automatically punch anything that comes close, and has a few different fire attacks. More importantly, he can eliminate the pillars of ice that have somehow formed in this bright, warm environment, allowing you to access the next part of the game, which involves, tracking down some rebels or something. The threads of the story really are pretty bare at this point. The difficulty is picking up a little, and the environments are getting a little tougher to navigate. The game walks a pretty fine line between giving you locations that are fun and challenging to explore, and ones that are confusing and irritating to find your way through. But it stays on the right side of that line for the vast majority of its duration, and at its best it's reminiscent of something like Landstalker in terms of compelling exploration. Anyway, you battle your way through more environments, a castle, another dungeon, a ship, and there you encounter Agito, the bearer of the Silver Armlet, your apparent nemesis. Not that he actually does much, he just issues some vague threats and flies away. He's not the most engaging villain in video game history. And so the game progresses, more dungeons, more mild puzzles, some switches to be flipped, some keys to be found, that sort of thing. When I was watching back some of the footage I'd recorded, it all started to seem a bit repetitive, but while actually playing it didn't really feel like that. Sure, many of the environments are similar and feature similar elements in combat encounters, but they're all crafted with enough skill and creativity to sustain your interest and to create a coherent sense of structure to the game world. However, it's about this time that the most irritating element in the entire game rears its ugly head, the platforming. Not that these platforms have heads, ugly or otherwise, but they are annoyingly small, move either too fast or too slow, and worst of all, they tend to be accompanied by enemies whose sole purpose in life is to knock you off and send you plummeting to your death. Well, no, not death. Thankfully, you lose only a small portion of health when you fall off, and you respawn safely on solid ground. But even this can grow to be a pretty big deal when you fall off over and over and over. Fortunately, most of the platforming sections are fairly brief, but unfortunately, they tend to be in locations that you end up travelling through multiple times, especially if you get lost and have to wander around trying to figure out where to go next, which happens more and more often as the dungeons get more complex and as my brain cells rapidly die off. Now, I'm not going to say the platforming is the most irritating thing in the history of gaming, far from it. In fact, by the standards of the day, it would hardly warrant a mention. But I did take a deep sigh any time I came across one of those sections, and they were the source of most of my reloaded save states. We're close to meeting the third summon now, but before that there's a dragon boss to be defeated. It's actually pretty easy, certainly it's less of a challenge than any of the platforming that had to be done to reach it, and it's even easier if you use one of the special weapons you're sure to have in your possession by now. I haven't mentioned these yet because I rarely made use of them, but they can be incredibly handy. Ali's basic weapon is a short-bladed knife, and it's rather effective, but sometimes enemies will drop other weapons like swords of various strengths, or bows, or bombs. But they have limited uses. Bows will run out of ammo, swords will break after a certain number of hits, and bombs will, well, blow up. The swords in particular can decimate foes much faster than your knife can, but they are quite rare to find. And that fact combined with their usefulness meant that, of course, I almost never used them. And a useful weapon that is never used is no use at all. I think Sun Tzu said that in The Art of War. This dragon, though, looks scary enough that I figured I'd finally unsheath one, and yeah, it did its job. And so we now acquire the third summon, Shade the Shadow Thing, and he's pretty dang useful. While active, he'll take damage on your behalf, although this drains your magic pretty quickly. More importantly, he'll also prevent you from being knocked back when you're hit, which can be super valuable when trying to navigate those damn platform sections. Okay, there's one more summon to be found, and his dungeon is, I think, the best part of the game. It's not different in any substantial way to anything that's come before, it's just a particularly well-designed area where all the elements of the game come together well. Even the platforming bit here is kind of tolerable, as the platforms move in regular patterns and there aren't any enemies to knock you off. I was starting to worry about my supply of healing items though. I haven't really talked about these before either, but they're pretty simple. Enemies will randomly drop items that restore some or all of your health and or magic, but you can only hold a certain amount, and for me at least, there seem to be extended periods where the enemies weren't dropping many of them at all. I don't know if it's truly random or if there is some system behind it, but there were a few occasions where I was down to my last couple of items. I don't think I ever ran out completely, but it was touch and go at some points. Your magic does actually replenish itself quite quickly if you don't have a summon active, so if you can find a source of water, you can summon Ditto, heal yourself, then dismiss her for essentially free health. But water's not everywhere, and it's not something you can do in the heat of battle, so you will be relying quite heavily on items, and watching your supplies dwindle can be a little stressful. Especially when you fall off the damn platforms 20 times just trying to get to the other side of the room. Actually, having said this is possibly the best part of the game, it's also the only part that had me severely stuck. I flipped every switch I could find, found every key there was to be found, and opened every locked door, but still I could not progress. The central door in the main hall remained blocked. If I'd played this game 30 years ago, I would have happily spent a dozen hours trying to figure out what I was missing, but I just don't have the patience these days, so I shamefully admit that I went out and looked up a walkthrough. Turns out what you have to do is light every single lantern in the place, using Ifrit's fire magic. I probably should have figured this out myself, or at least considered the possibility. I knew that you could use him to light lanterns, and the fact that only some of them were already lit should have been a clue. But I can't feel too guilty about not grasping the inscrutable logic of video games from nearly a third of a century ago. So with all the lanterns lit, you face a rock boss who isn't too much of a problem, and then, oh dear god, a boss sitting in the middle of a void surrounded by those goddamn platforms. And yet, this fight isn't actually as bad as I feared when I first entered the room. I mean, yeah, it's frustrating, and I got bumped into oblivion countless times by his electric orbs, but it didn't take too many whacks to the back of his head to get him down. And now we have the fourth and final summon, a piranha plant from Mario. Well, okay, that's not what it's called, but it's definitely what it reminds me of. It's pretty handy in combat, as it can be summoned to a location of your choosing and will take a chomp out of anything that gets close enough. Back to the castle we go, only to find out that it's under attack, and your younger sister is being kidnapped by Agito, who is now demanding that you bring him a large cube for some reason. As it happens, the large cube is in the castle's dungeon, so that's yet another dungeon crawl for you to go on. The cube claims to be the origin of Agito's power and the keeper of his soul. That's one hell of a cube. So let's bring it to Agito, I guess. He gives you back your sister and retreats to his lair. You, of course, follow. And this may be the most irritating part of the whole game. It's not bad as such, there's just too much bullcrap here. Like these grabby things that can't be killed and rapidly drain your health. And this platforming section, which may be the worst in the entire game. The boss at least isn't too painful, at least not once you realise you have to shoot him with your armlet to expose his weak points. With that thing out of the way, it's time to enter the final dungeon. And it's, well, fine. It's not the most annoying place in the game, it's not the most interesting. It's just another dungeon really, but since most of the dungeons in this game are pretty cool, that's no bad thing. The penultimate room is kind of confusing though. There's a long, narrow platform with a seemingly endless stream of enemies being blown towards you by the wind. Which is, weird. But once you figure out where to stand to most effectively take them out, it's actually a really good place to farm healing items, and I wonder if that was the intention. I still don't know how I got them to actually stop appearing though. The first time I went in I just mowed them down for ages, until I wondered if maybe I was supposed to go somewhere else. So I went out and did some more walking around before I concluded, nope, I must be supposed to get past all those enemies. Second time around I fought a bunch more before they abruptly stopped appearing. I have no idea why or how that happened, but I'm kind of beyond caring. So, final boss time. Well, there's two final bosses actually, starting with Agito. But remember how I said I almost never used the special weapons I found? Well, that means that by this point I had an inventory full of them, and particularly powerful ones at that. And this seemed like the time to use them. Agito barely had a chance to fight back. And the final boss didn't fare much better. It took a bit longer, you have to chop down his tentacles before he becomes vulnerable, but that wasn't much of a chore. Plus I had enough recovery items by this point to survive the fury of the 7 hells. So, with my faithful piranha plant at my side, I hacked this monstrosity to death. And then, in a shocking twist, it turns out that Agito was your long-lost elder sister all along, who'd been brainwashed by the power of the silver armlet. You know, your elder sister, Gwyn. I think she'd only been mentioned once, maybe halfway through the game. I had definitely forgotten about her by this time. So I wasn't exactly overcome with emotion when, racked by guilt, she chose to stay banished from the kingdom. Joined by the spirits Ali had summoned, she bids him farewell, and he returns home. Hooray, etc. And that's Beyond Oasis. According to the in-game clock, it took very nearly 5.5 hours to beat, but that doesn't account for the numerous reloads. By Mega Drive standards, that makes it a fairly substantial game, although not on the level of a true JRPG like Shining Force or Phantasy Star, or even something more comparable like Landstalker. That said, I clearly missed quite a bit. Apparently I only found 23 out of 60 jewels, which increased the power of your summons. I knew there were at least a few points where I could have backtracked and used the newly acquired summons ability to access a new area, but to have missed that many jewels surprises me. Also, there's an optional 104 combat dungeon, which apparently rewards you with a powerful sword with unlimited uses if you manage to finish it, but I definitely wasn't going to attempt that. And it turned out I had plenty of swords at my disposal anyway, certainly enough to make a joke of the last boss. Regardless, there's clearly plenty of skippable content, and while I was content to skip it this time around, if I'd been playing this game 30 years ago, I'm sure I would have absolutely relished tracking it all down. But it's not 30 years ago, so what do I make of Story of Thor today? Well, it's definitely a good game, possibly even a classic. Landstalker may not be the most relevant comparison. Story of Thor probably has more in common with the Mana series on the SNES, but I never really played those games, so Landstalker is what my mind lands on when thinking of comparable games. Story of Thor clearly has a much more dynamic combat system, but in terms of creating a coherent world that's fun to explore and interact with, Landstalker is definitely a better experience. But that comparison is probably unfair. Story of Thor should stand on its own merits, and it can stand proud, even if it didn't perhaps live up to its high potential. But I hear there was a sequel. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for... Oh crap, I forgot about Yuzo Koshiro! His company made this game, he did the music, and is a legend of the craft, so how could I forget about him? Well, the fact is, I found the music in this game to be utterly forgettable. In fact, trying to recall it all now, I can really only remember some of the odd volume changes in the early sections. Well, that's disappointing. Okay, like I was saying, thanks for watching. I'd like to come up with an original and amusing way of saying like, comment and subscribe, but it's way past my bedtime, so maybe just imagine I said something funny. Until next time though, get off my lawn.